Welcome our distinguished keynote speaker, Mr. Bruce Fein, representative of the collaborating organization TADAlliance, volunteers, and all the guests from different parts of the world, to an exclusive virtual session with Mr. Bruce Fein, attorney at law, author, and expert on the U.S. Constitution and international law, international discussion on stopping war through separation of powers, entrusting the power exclusively to legislators. As a brief introduction of this exclusive session with Mr. Bruce Fein, a detailed intro will follow by Mr. Uğur Kara, president of the TADAlliance. As some of you well aware of that recently, like Millennium Global has formed a coalition towards contributing to the 2024 UN General Assembly 79 Summit of the Future through a long-term vision and advocacy purpose for compulsory peace education, information communication technologies, ICTs, from kindergarten to K-12. That including a lifelong education on this two-merit concept. On this basis, we are privileged and honored to present you jointly with TADAlliance an exclusive session. By now you all know, with Mr. Bruce Fein, attorney at law and author, stopping war through a separation of power, entrusting the powers exclusively to legislators in support of the 2024 UNJ79 Summit of the Future. In correlation with the above referred concept and beyond vision, the session will be particularly focused on understanding the centrality of the separation of powers to liberty and prosperity. A structural bill of rights requires a threshold of wisdom and learning through all levels of the education process that will illustrate the fundamental requirements of the proposed vision from the legislative and policy making, both in connection with the United States and the international perspectives. I am Bircan Ünver, founder, president, and TV producer, and head NGO of the late Millennium Global Charitable Human Advancement Organization, which was formed based in New York in 2001 with 501c3 status and associated with the United Nations Department of Global Communication since 2005. And we are specially accredited to the UNJ79 Summit of the Future. Yeah, with that, I am your host today, and Mr. Kara will accompany me. We are grateful, needless to say, to Mr. Bruce Fein to providing us the foundation and principles and pathways on the grounds of legislation and international law in support of our common future and compulsory peace education and information technologies from once again, kindergarten to K-12 and beyond. On the same side of the token, we are also grateful to our collaborative partner of this session, to Mr. Uğur Kara, president of the TADAlliance, who will introduce Mr. Fein. We thank and welcome you all and to every one of you in all parts of the world. Now, no further ado, I would like to hand over the microphone to Mr. Uğur Kara, president of the TADAlliance, to introduce Mr. Fein. Welcome to Mr. Kara. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Welcome to today's session. This is our second operation with like Millennium, Ms. Bircan. And I'd like to say good morning to everyone in the West Coast, and good afternoon and good evening. We have attendance from also around the world from India. Why are we here today? Why are we in this meeting, right? What are we doing? The reason is we have a big initiative, a large initiative all around the world through United Nations. It is called Summit of the Future. Summit of the Future. So what's wrong with the future? Why are we worried about the future? That's what we're going to talk about here. As you know, we're going through several wars around the world. Why there are wars happening? Why countries are attacking each other? What is the root cause? And how can we prevent this? And what is the role of education in this prevention? This is what we're going to talk about today. And our teacher, literally our leading teacher, Mr. Bruce Fein, besides his legal experience, he is literally, for me, the representation of Socrates today. If you ever wished to spend a few minutes with Socrates and ask him questions, here's your chance. This is Bruce Fein with us. He had more than 50 years of experience in United Nations management, constitutional law, international law. And he served in the government under Reagan administration for 2 terms. So if you have any questions, please note down, and we'll be giving spaces between the speech, some gaps, and we'll ask you present them, and you'll be able to get your answers immediately. At the end of our conversation, as you heard from Bircan, you'll be able to ask many more questions. So I'm giving the floor to Mr. Bruce Fein. Thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you, Ern. Thank you for the wonderful introduction. I always, in a gesture of humility, remind the audience that nothing that a host says is under oath, so you're able to exaggerate the accomplishments of the speaker. But putting that aside, the summit of the future, why do we need a summit for the future? It's because the summit in the past is rather dreary. War has been the scourge of the species from day one. It has never been eliminated. There have been intermissions at best, but it persists. As recently as 1933, Albert Einstein wrote a letter to Sigmund Freud, and Einstein was a genius. Freud, in his own way, was a genius, said, why war? He could not understand why the species kept elevating and paying homage to proficiency in killing other members of the species. So he wrote a letter to Sigmund Freud, and Freud didn't have an answer either. It is, I believe, the most challenging and important question to answer in the history of the world by far. More important than Newton's laws of motion, more important than Einstein's theories of general and special relativity, more important than going to the moon or going to Mars. How can we survive as a species in a civilized way where peace and prosperity prevail, that we treat other people according to their character and accomplishments and nothing more? It's a huge, huge challenge. And I hope to shed light on this question by kind of tracing, in some sense, the history, if you will, of the species. If we go back, and I start with Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, his greatest insight was to identify survival for the sake of survival as the overriding narrative of all species. It didn't have any moral content to it. Whatever traits contributed to survival were going to be predominant in any particular species. And we are part of the culmination, if you will, continuing to evolve, of that Darwinian understanding of evolution. And it has been true from the beginning of time that war has plagued the species. We don't know exactly why, but I can deduce it from the following. And I have spent, I don't want to be immodest, over 500,000 hours thinking and writing about this issue. The overriding motivations for the species is power, money, sex, celebrity status or fame, creature comforts, and certainty to get to heaven after you die. But among those, power is the most coveted gratification of all, because it gives to the species a sense of self-esteem. I'm better than you. Now, why does the species covet power? Why does it need to feel that the power is their sense of identity? It's because in general, we are all born virtually 100% hormonal. We come out of the womb, we need food, we need shelter, we need tender, loving care. But we don't have brains, right? That comes later. And the reason why we're endowed with what I call cerebral faculties is to change that balance where you're 100% hormonal, have no moral sensitivity, have no brains whatsoever as to what you ought to do, asking why rather than how, to living a life where you always ask why before how, and your cerebral capacities dominate your hormonal urges. So you're not a slave anymore to your passions. You've mastered them. Now you do what your cerebral faculties tell you is the right thing to do. But there are very few people who are able to make that transition from being hormonal to cerebral from the day of birth. It's much easier to live a life where you don't need to struggle with many morally agonizing questions if you just have power and said, I do it and it's right because I can do it. It reminds me of a passage in Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, where he's describing the relations between the various Greek city-states. And he says as follows, the strong do what they can and the weak suffer what they must. That was the rule of international relations. That was the rule between the various tribes, if you will. No moral content. If you're strong, you do what you can get away with. If you're weak, you can't. Now, why is it that the hormonal component of the species remains so dominant over the cerebral that leads us to, or at least the majority, to find their self-identity in developing greater and greater proficiency at killing other members of the species, because that shows that they're more important and more powerful? And I believe it's a staggering deficit in education. But not in education in the technical sense, STEM education. We've made enormous progress. We split the atom. We develop nuclear weapons. We do AI, all sorts of technologies that couldn't even been conceived of thousands of years ago. But what we've made zero progress, none whatsoever in those thousands of years, in understanding and inculcating a sense of moral learning and wisdom. What is the right thing to do? What is fair? What is justice? James Madison wrote in Federalist 51, justice is the end of civil society. Justice is the end of government. It's not easy to decide the parameters of justice. It's not like a Euclidean formula. It's more blurry. But in general, it means that justice is a situation where everybody's station in life, no matter where they live, no matter who their parents are, has been determined by only two things: their personal character and accomplishments, nothing more. That is the objective. That's what I call the pinnacle of justice. We know we're never going to achieve that because there is the accident of birth that none of us controls. We don't choose our parents. We don't choose where we're born, whether we're born in the Sahel, whether we're born with a silver spoon, or born into poverty or a famine or anything like that. Those are things that we just don't control. But we can work to try to minimize those fortuities in lives as establishing discrepancies between where that person sits in the social hierarchy and where they began. And we do that by eliminating from power and from status in society anything other than, say, character and accomplishments. Now, that, however, has not been the rule. It's never been the rule in any society. Mentioned Socrates. He first was very doubtful when the oracles of Delphi informed him he was the wisest man in all of Athens. And he said, well, that can't be true. And they said, it is, because you know what you don't know. You know you need to ask questions. And you could be wrong, and you're always open to learning. Always answer why before how. And he soon went around and he was talking to what he all thought were the wise men and women of Athens. And he says, yeah, they really don't know. They think they know what they don't know. What is the end of life? End is justice. And in some sense, he understood, and I'm emphasizing to this audience to understand, that the end of life isn't just longevity, maybe live more than Methuselah over 900 years. Because the purpose of life is to be immortal through example, through inspiring those yet to be born to do the right thing by your example and words. That is the only unsoiled sense of power that there is. It doesn't depend upon bribes or money, doesn't depend upon threats, holding up stones or weapons or guns to compel. Just through the power of moral suasion and perfection, people follow. Now, I want to go back briefly and now kind of explain how it is, what we're searching for in this particular lecture, that to be immodest has never, ever been done before. Actually find a feasible, plausible solution of cure, if you could, to the inherent tendency of the species towards war as an expression of self-identity and superiority. It's true of every single tribe that's ever existed. We know, for example, even high water marks of sermonizing. Jesus' Sermon on the Mount, turn the other cheek. He delivered his Sermon on the Mount speech in the most blood-stained land in the history of the world. It's not because his words were wrong, but he didn't have a solution to the inherent, I say, depravity of the species. Again, that covets power for the sake of power more than anything else, without any explanation of why they want the power, other than it makes me feel good. So there have been many who have criticized war, said it's bad, we need to stop fighting. It's been said as we speak today in the Middle East, we need to stop the killing in Gaza, the West Bank, in Israel, in Lebanon. Now it's in Yemen, it may go to Iran. Well, it's wonderful, and it's laudatory that people think war is bad and not to stop. But just saying the words doesn't provide a cure. You'll see all the words said that way, we still find as we speak right now. Unrestrained warfare, indiscriminate killings, without accountability. There's going to be no trials at the International Criminal Court, certainly not in our lifetimes. So I have spent virtually my entire life thinking, well, is there a cure? The cure needs to be less bad than the disease. But if a cure, even if it doesn't end all the evil, if it just diminishes it, it's worth doing. If you're able to diminish the incidence of war, you become the greatest medicine man in the history of the world. You will save more lives, more misery, more suffering by preventing one war than all the doctors doing bypass surgery and everything else. And I'm not trying to at all discredit the great talents that medicine has brought us in saving people who have suffered. But stopping wars is the greatest medicine. That's why I thought it was rather, I'm not sure, bizarre that the species at one time, in recent weeks, has, in a very laudable way, rushed in 650,000 vaccines for polio for children. A wonderful idea. It's great, I applaud it. But did nothing to end the warfare that's going to kill the students, the children who get the polio the next day. So you see, and the species doesn't even recognize that. There's not a single newspaper that wrote and said, this seems bizarre. Why we seem indifferent to killing the little kids, but we don't want them to get polio? There seems to be an inverse proportion of the threat to the children. No one wants to talk about how you end war. And I'm not saying it's an easy answer. But if you go back, I want to say, if we look and try to examine warfare, and we have a long track record. So if you consider each war kind of like a laboratory experiment for science, we have countless experiments out there. And what is common to all wars is that they're initiated by what we call in the political science the executive branch. It's the leader. It's Alexander the Great. It's Napoleon. It's Adolf Hitler. Mussolini. It's always the executive. Because you need, and that was also true when the Romans were fighting Carthage, you had Hannibal on the one hand and Scipio Africanus on the other hand, always the executive fighting. Of course, in some sense, you need a Caesar to fight a war because you can't prevail if you have deliberation. War requires speed, secrecy, dispatch. You don't have time in cases of war to sit around and deliberate. Even if you make an error, it's oftentimes worse to sit and do nothing. And so the common feature of every single war is always the decision is made by the executive who has the power to issue rules by decree. And when you're in times of war, then martial law comes into play and the leader decrees whatever the leader wants to be the rule for that particular minute and moment. Why is that phenomenon so conspicuous and so enduring? And this is where I rely upon what I fear my mentor, James Madison. He understood that the reason why the executive craves war and will concoct excuses is because wartime gives the president or the executive all the power, right? Diminishes all the other branches. You don't have judges there. You don't have legislators. He says, here's my chance. If I have war, I get secrecy. I can kill my opponents. I don't have any legal restraints on what I want to do. I maybe get monuments. Books will be written about me. I'll have a mausoleum like Napoleon. I'll have a huge obelisk like the Duke of Wellington at Waterloo. I'll have pages and books written about me. And one of the reasons why that belief is so pronounced in executive is because if they look historically, it's true. If you go to Greece today, who do you think the tourists visit more? The tomb of Alexander the Great, who spent his whole life killing other human beings without purpose, or Socrates? It's not even close. If you go to France today, you think Napoleon's tomb, his mausoleum, is worshipped more than Voltaire or Rousseau? Of course. Everywhere in the world, if you're a leader and you look, hey, how do I win reverence and veneration among the species? I really need to be excellent at killing, and I hope I win the war. Because if I'm not, I may not. But even if you go to Mongolia, Mongolia continues to celebrate Genghis Khan. I'm not singling him out as worse than the others. What is this whole life? Killing everybody. Then he brought the Mongolian kingdom all the way to the Middle East for many years when he died, and then it shrunk like all empires do, because there's one principle of warfare. You can't kill your way out of war. Ultimately, you end up making more enemies than you kill by your ruthlessness. And then you self-destruct. Go away, but don't worry, somebody new will come along and replace you. So we know that if we entrust the war power to the executive, the wars will never, ever, ever end. And they have not. Now, there has only been one experiment to the contrary in the history of the world, constitutional experiment, and that was in the United States. We fought for our independence from a kingdom, King George III, and we had very learned delegates to our Constitutional Convention in 1787. They had read about all confederations. They were very worldly about the Roman Empire, about the Battle of Thermopylae, about the various and sundry crusades and all the stupidities in history. And they were uniform. We are never going to give the president power to go to war on his own. It can only be done by Congress. It means that Congress, unlike the executive, it's open. It's a deliberative body. You can't do it fast. You have to think about it. You have to get the people involved because they are the ones who vote directly for members of Congress, the House and the Senate. And most important, there's nothing in it for the legislators. In times of war, their power goes away. They just have to tax to support the war. But otherwise, where have you ever seen on any pedestal in any capital of the world a legislator celebrated, Doesn't happen. It's always the warrior celebrated everywhere. So the framers were very wise. We'll give the war power to the Congress. Both the House and the Senate have to vote for war. Very confident that it would probably never or very seldom happen unless we were actually attacked and the peace had already been broken. And they say this consensus was universal. No one opposed that. Even though we had at the time somebody, the equivalent of the figure of the grandeur, if you will, of Alexander Napoleon, called George Washington. He was the commander of the Continental Army that defeated the British, and he could have been a king. In fact, he was offered a crown and said, I didn't fight this war to be a king. I don't want to be a king. We need liberty here as our summum bonum, the North Star, not domination. And he presided at the Constitutional Convention. So what happens when we have, the first time in history, we have the legislature as opposed to the executive responsible for taking the nation from a state of peace to war? We have no wars unless we're attacked. And that was because not only did the legislature believe that, but the presidents themselves said that. George Washington basically said openly, first president, I can't go to war unless Congress deliberates and approves it. Thomas Jefferson, I can only go to self-defense unless Congress permits me to go on the offense. And Thomas Jefferson was the third president of the United States. Everybody understood that axiom. And of course, at that time, our North Star was not domination and control of empire. We were not envious of the British. We thought the British were very stupid to have an empire. Why are you trying to control everybody in the world? Our glory, as John Quincy Adams said, his very famous July 4th, 1821 address to Congress, our glory is liberty, the march of the mind, not the march of the foot soldier. And Quincy Adams, he was the son of John Adams and later became president in 1824. He was a very wise man. And he understood, he said in his address, if we become a war power, if we go fight for other people's liberties every time we see oppression, and we don't really know how to cure, our themes will not be liberty anymore. Our themes will not be the rule of law. In times of war, there are no laws. You just kill, right? Whoever thinks, if you're on the winning side, no law applies to you. On the losing side, anything applies to you. And therefore, we would lose our heart and soul as a people who covet liberty and justice above all if we decided we would go abroad in search of monsters to destroy, thinking that we are so angelic and wise, we know how other people should govern themselves. You have a hard enough time governing ourselves before trying to export, any wisdom abroad. It's a very hard struggle just to govern your own self, trying to master your passions so you're not a slave rather than a master. And that was the prevailing ethos of the United States. So that when, shortly after our independence in 1776, there grew up all sorts of revolutions in nearby neighbors, largely in Central and South America, revolts against the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Now, we didn't intercede in any of them. Said, listen, we wish independence and freedom well abroad, but we fight only to defend our own. We let those play out. We didn't try to dominate any of that. Today, you can imagine if there are wars breaking out in that place today, United States would be everywhere, like we were in Cuba for years, Dominican Republic, Haiti, Chile, everywhere else. So how did that change? So we basically were able to resist, a temptation to go to war in order to get this vicarious thrill, an adrenaline thrill. We're better than you. We beat you at war. We're more proficient at killing. It began that thesis began to erode in increments. It wasn't something that happened in one fell swoop. And first began when our founding fathers, and I apologize, Abigail Adams was kind of a founding mother, but she didn't get much play because unfortunately the the framers did not recognize at that time the contributions that women could make because they have brains like men as well. And she urged the framers to pay attention to the oppression of women. They didn't do that. Didn't come till much later. But putting that aside, by 1836, 37, 38, all of the original thinkers behind the Constitutional Convention, the educated people who, even if they didn't have diplomas, they had spent their whole lives reading and thinking about these issues. They aren't on TikTok. They aren't influencers. They aren't going on TV. They spend their leisure thinking, and they openly recognize that they had to make our Republican dispensation work, or it would be viewed as the world as a showing that self-government was impossible. Then we have to make sacrifices. We have to make compromises to make this work, because the future of liberty is at stake. It's not just for us, but for those yet to be born. And it was truly remarkable what sacrifices they made, compromise they made, even if they were imperfect. I mean, but they didn't do anything with slavery where it existed, right? It phased out in the North, but not in the South. And they didn't emancipate women till much later. But they set the framework that enabled these reforms to come. And I want to underscore their courage, and I'm speaking to an audience, because if we don't have courage, this is not going anyplace. Aristotle said that courage sits at the summit of virtues, because without courage, no other virtue is possible. I mean, you have nice themes to play on your piano, but if you don't have the courage to defend them against adversity, they're not going in. And I like to emphasize that when we declared in the United States, our Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1776, there are 56 signatories. They were signing their death warrants. They didn't win the war, and they were fighting against the biggest empire in the world. They're getting hung and killed for treason. But they didn't turn back, and it wasn't a sure thing. At that time, maybe a third in favor of independence, a third with the British, third kind of undecided. That's courage, right? Said, okay, it's worth it, because the future of liberty and justice is at stake. If not us, who? But that ethos, that courage, by the late 1830s, it kind of dwindled, because we were dealing with virtual demigods at our founding. People, I can't stress enough, educated people who understood not all wisdom is in books, but huge portions are, and the others simply learning and celebrating wisdom more than proficiency in killing other people as the hallmark of greatness. But that began to erode by the 1830s, and we propped up this intellectually vacant idea called manifest destiny. Well, it's manifest that the United States needs to go across the continent and conquer everybody. And then that gave birth to a Mexican-American War. But again, even the Mexican-American War, which was declared by the Congress, but unfortunately it was declared because they were deceived by the president, James K. Polk, who lied to them. They didn't have video cameras or online journalism about, the Mexican had killed an American soldier on American soil. And indeed, once the Congress found out about it, they voted a resolution in the House that the war was illegal, and there were attempts to impeach the president. But the war ended soon after, and so it became a moot political issue. Now, we stayed, however, generally faithful, to the understanding that, war is the bane. You avoid it unless you're attacked. Up until for almost maybe even more than 100 years. But it was sustained because of education, because we continued to praise and celebrate in our culture those who had learning, those who had wisdom, more than the soldier, more than the armored knight. So Rodin's The Thinker was given more prominence than Alexander the Great. It may seem trivial, but it's very important into what cues are sent to your young people as to what they should strive for as they move forward in life. We then, however, because of our success in largely resisting war, became fabulously successful economically. Immigrants all over the world came to the United States. We didn't even have any real restrictions other than the contagious disease until 1882. Immigrants came with entrepreneurship, with boldness, with moxie, and they helped spur fabulous economic growth. By 1880s, 1890s, the United States was producing more than Great Britain. We're an economic superpower, but separation of powers and trusting the war power of Congress had kept us in check. We weren't a global power like Great Britain or France, even the Austrian-Hungarian Empire. And Russia was plowing its way into the Siberian winters and asserting itself, fighting regularly with Turkey, the Ottoman Empire, trying to get access to warm water port. But we were not doing that. We became very wealthy. And unfortunately, at the same time, education became less treasured and prized in our culture because the framers were long gone. They'd all died away. And the natural instinct of the species is to celebrate the warrior. One man comes in on a horse and says, "Hey, I'm great. Here's my spear. We'll do everything and you'll feel great. You don't have to think anymore." And that became that. Then I think the character I think that epitomizes that idea more than any other, Theodore Roosevelt, who rose in the late 1890s, 1900. He fought in the Spanish-American War. He rode up San Juan Hill. He was celebrated because he could kill the Spaniards and Cubans. And he said it was great and thrilling to be in war, and he loved it. And that was how you tested, mankind. Courage was in warfare. Courage was not moral courage. Courage was not Socrates taking the hemlock rather than accept a caged and unemancipated mind. It was just physical courage. But moral courage is much more sparse and much more important because that moral courage is nothing worth physical courage fighting for. They don't have civilization. Why are you fighting at all? But Theodore Roosevelt epitomized this new idea. Oh, man on horseback. Now let's make a Faustian bargain. The heck with liberty and justice. We have the ability to conquer the world because look at our economic might now. And after our success in the Spanish-American War, we need to flex our muscles. And there wasn't any intellectual remnants that had survived from 1787 that resisted what I call the huge folly. Because we could see, if they wanted to open our eyes, the British were going under. The British Empire was crumbling, even just at the time of World War I. They couldn't sustain it. Almost 90% of the British expenditures at the heyday of their empire was for warfare. They're going bankrupt. They couldn't even participate in World War I without our loans. Even at that time, it became even worse in World War II. So without the intellectual and moral resistance to the Faustian bargain to trade liberty and justice for power, we struck the bargain. So President McKinley, we made up this idea that the Spanish had blown up a U.S. naval ship, the U.S. Maine and Havana Harbor. So we created this contingent of fear. We need to go to war with Cuba to liberate Cuba because of self-determination, but we didn't limit it to Cuba. We also fought in the Philippines and told the Filipinos, you thought we were fighting for self-determination, but no, we conquered you. They had lived under Spanish conquest for hundreds of years. Now we said, now you can live under our conquest. We conquer the Puerto Rico. And so at that time, the de facto rule by the Spanish-American War was, even though the Constitution's express language says only Congress can take us from peace to war, de facto, Congress became an ink blot voluntarily. Just go to war. It makes us really feel good because we're so powerful. And presidents, increasingly since that time, have just decided to go to war on their own. If we even think, right after the Spanish-American War, Teddy Roosevelt, we're into Panama, we're into Haiti, we're into the Dominican Republic, we're into Nicaragua, we're into Mexico. None of these wars declared. And everyone feels, wow, we're flexing our muscles. And nobody says anything in Congress. There's no impeachments, nothing. So that was when the experiment we had de facto ended. Because even as we speak today, the U.S. Constitution hasn't changed a word of the War Power Clause. But as a practical matter, no matter how much evidence you marshal to show only Congress can get us to war, people just laugh. Well, that's a fringe view of James Madison. Well, he wrote the document. You haven't amended the document. And that's where we are today. This is why the United States, got involved in Afghanistan, Iraq, Somalia, Libya. Now we're giving weapons. We're co-belligerents in Gaza. We're co-belligerents in Ukraine. We may stimulate and provoke a nuclear war against China over the South China Sea. Anyway, all things that show what happens when the restraint on war that is delivered by entrusting the authority exclusive to the legislature is handed off to the executive. Because the executive, they lie about the foreign danger. They turn fleas into elephants. And oh my gosh, if Saddam Hussein, if he did have WMD or Gaddafi, he would be an immediate, imminent threat to destroy the United States, which is obviously nonsense. Saddam Hussein worried more about Iran than the United States his whole career. But the executive, because it's secret and is able to lie without being held accountable, because they invoke state secrets doctrine and no oversight, people believe this stuff. Gosh, we're going to have deaths on the sidewalks, unless we're at war, and push our defense perimeter like 6, 7, 8, 9, 10,000 miles away. We got to have our submarines and our aircraft carriers in the South China Sea. Otherwise, we're unsafe, and because the species is easily frightened, very few challenge it. And what makes the challenge even less likely is because there's so much money to be made in this projection of military power. You have these huge military industrial security complexes. The Boeings, the Northrop Grummons, the Lockheeds, they make huge campaign contributions. They have a lot of employees. And so, hey, this is great. People make money and we protect ourselves. Why are we going to give up this gravy train? So all those forces work against any kind of restraint in projecting military power. Now, this works everywhere in the world. It works in a way that's more conspicuous in the United States because we're the biggest military power in the history of the world. But in a smaller scale, every country acts the same. Why is that? Because the species and the DNA of the species is the same everywhere. Kant, called that, mankind is made of crooked timber. I don't think the timber analogy, in my judgment, is not as precise as saying, no, it's built in to our DNA at birth, craving the hormonal gratifications. And the number one gratification is power. Power is the only gratification that doesn't recede or become jaded by repetition. That's insatiable. It always feeds on itself, which explains why a military general as brilliant as Napoleon would go to Moscow in winter. Said, what are you doing that for? This is the stupidest blunder ever. You're supposed to be a genius. He destroyed himself. He didn't know how to stop. Same with Alexander, same with Adolf Hitler, Operation Barbarossa. And that's what I think is partly demonstrative of the fact that it is the worst element of the entire species. Power. I got to feel better than you. And it doesn't matter. And it applies not only at the highest levels of government where you have generals, presidents, whatever, but applies at the lower levels too. There is, unfortunately, this vicarious sense of importance that comes even if you're just a grunt, a private in the Army. Well, but I'm on the team that's winning, so I feel good about it. And I think I like to illustrate that phenomenon by a poem. It was written by Lord Tennyson. He's a British poet about Crimean War. So it's 1854, 1855, 56, and involved Russia, France, Great Britain, Turkey, the Ottoman Empire at that time before Turkey. And the poem celebrates, the absolute stupidity of British soldiers killing themselves by galloping into a valley of death. And he writes about the soldiers, ours not to reason why, ours but to do and die, into the valley of death rode the 600. And then instead of saying, they should have overthrown the general who told them, we're not going to die as cannon fodder. This is stupid. Tennyson valorizes them. That's great that they didn't ask any questions. It's great that they just followed orders. The famous or infamous following orders defense of Adolf Eichmann, the one who shipped all the millions of Jews to Auschwitz and Bergen-Belsen and elsewhere in World War II. That is the Eichmann trial in Jerusalem after World War II. But in any event, that's what we confront. So I do not believe that all the admonishments, all of the encouragements in the world telling people, well, be good. Don't get thrilled over just having power over other people. Works. It doesn't. If it worked, Jesus would have won. If it worked, the Sermon on the Mount would have ended war. It didn't end war at all. Madison came up with this insight that the reason why we have government is a reflection on human nature. Because if men were angels, you wouldn't need government at all. There wouldn't have to be any evil. But because men are not angels, we have to pit what he said, ambition against ambition. You have to take the species, given its depravity, accepting with very, very few aberrations, counting on your hand with fingers left over, that people, especially entrusted with power, are going to exercise it for self-interest. So you need to pit ambition against ambition. And he said that's why if we give the war power to the legislative branch, it's not going to exercise it, except in cases where we're attacked and we have a right of self-defense, self-preservation, because there's nothing in it for them. If you're a legislator, you say, why is it that I would vote for something like this? I'm going to lose power. Let me give you a couple of examples how this is proved when actually it's been tried in recent years. In 2013, then President Obama asked Congress for declaration of war against Syria after the so-called chemical weapons use by Assad. It didn't get anywhere. It couldn't even get a vote out of the war hawks. Ted Cruz, Tom Cotton, nobody would vote for it. They were the ones who otherwise would stand up and say, yeah, we have to be the superpower of the world. But anyway, when actually they were told, you're going to vote on this? No way. The bill didn't even get out of committee. It didn't get out of committee. When Bill Clinton, because this is not a partisan issue, but Bill Clinton, he went and he asked Congress, declaration of war against Serbia because of the maltreatment of the Albanians, Kosovars in Serbia. The Congress voted it down. He couldn't get a vote for it, right? They voted it down. He said, okay, I'll just do the same thing and say it's not a war. And he went to war on his own. Remember, big bombings, 96 days in succession, he even bombed the Chinese embassy. Now, a friend of mine who was in Congress, his name is Tom Campbell, he went to lawsuit and said, this is an illegal war. Now, I voted against it. And the court said, you don't have any standing. Congress as a unit, would not defend its war prerogative. So he didn't get any traction in the courts. And so Clinton just continued on, fought the war how he felt he wanted to fight it. But if we go back, now be more retrospective, from the time the Constitution in 1787 entrusted the war power to the Congress up until today, this is now 2024. So this is well over 2.5 centuries later. Not quite 2.5, about 240 years later. Congress has only voted 5 times to go to war when there was a conflict. And in each of those 5 times, they were convinced that we had already been attacked. So we were already in a state of war. It's the War of 1812 with the British, Mexican-American War, Spanish-American War, World War I with the German Nazi submarines, and World War II with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor. Not once in over 2 centuries has our legislative body ever voted to go to war except when it's thought that we're fighting in self-defense because someone else has already attacked us. Now, I think that's a pretty strong track record that if you give and confirm and actually insist that legislative bodies are the exclusive bodies that can take a nation from peace to war, that if wars don't end, they'll be hugely diminished. But it has to be a constitution or an allocation that's enforced in fact, like ours was for 100 years. If it's just a parchment paper and then the law is honored in the breach rather than the observance, it's not going to work, which is why today our war power doesn't serve as any restraint, because presidents, if they want to go to war, if they go to Congress, Congress has in the 21st century said no, no, no. Presidents say, okay, I'll go to war anyway. Congress doesn't do anything. I had worked years ago with a friend in Congress. His name was Congressman Walter Jones from North Carolina. I had Camp Lejeune was in his district. It was a military district, but Walter was on the Armed Services Committee, and he, with my assistance, introduced a resolution to make presidential wars that bypass Congress impeachable offenses. You kick him out of the White House. Unfortunately, I said finding co-sponsors was like searching for unicorns, because still our military-industrial complex and I think our ill-educated society, and when I say ill-educated, it's not because our society doesn't know how to do things technologically in a way that could have been undreamed of. It's ill-educated. They don't have any sense of moral knowledge and wisdom and courage, the things that make us human rather than subhuman. So presidents continue today, go to war on their own. We may be in war with China. I can guarantee you, if we go to war with China, it won't be because Congress voted for it. The president will decide, well, that's what we want to do. Go to war with Russia if he attacks somebody, NATO. It's all presidential decision-making. I say, and that is because, in my judgment, number one, the voters don't insist on the Congress exercising their prerogative. They acquiesce in this stuff. They keep sending these people back over and over again. And I think that because of the lack of serious education in the important elements of philosophy, law, and justice, as opposed to other things, how we can go to Mars and how you can do AI faster, the public doesn't know the importance of insisting upon peace and war only in self-defense to their own prosperity. They don't know that they're engaged in self-ruination. Because what I've spoken today, you can't hear anywhere else. No classroom in the United States will tell you what I told you today. They're all involved in the empire and the species. No, don't worry, just say war is bad and it will somehow go away. No, and they think that somehow, that goodness will like spring up, summon into being and prevent the species from killing each other. It's not going to happen. Thousands of years of laboratory experience shows it's not going to happen. Now, why do I believe that it's very, very difficult to accept what I've just told all of you? And I call it species narcissism. All species are narcissistic. They all think they're better than all the other species. The human species, we wake up, we don't think anything. We step on an ant or a beetle or whatever. We assume that we must be morally superior. We may not do it maliciously, but we don't have strokes of conscience over swatting a fly or something like that. We just assume it, but we have to ask, well, what is it? What is it that the human species has that maybe a fly doesn't have or a beetle doesn't have? Well, in my judgment, we have the ability with a cerebral capacity to seek justice, to be more than just hormonal and survive for the sake of survival, to try to use our wisdom and brain power to secure justice and liberty and freedom, and bring peace everywhere. Other animals, in my judgment, they don't have that capacity. They don't have that cerebral knowledge. But if we use that knowledge to kill ourselves, proficiency in killing is the hallmark of those who sit on pedestals. I'm sure the tigers and lions must be looking at the human species and laughing and say, wow, look at all the brain power they have and look what they're doing with it. Lions don't gather in hundreds of thousands to kill each other. They do. I'm not saying that they're a peaceful species. They fight over some territory and food and things like that, but nothing like the industrial scale that the human species does. Has there ever been in the animal kingdom and other human beings a Hiroshima and Nagasaki? And no, nothing even close. So there is a huge barrier to understanding and accepting the wisdom of how we try to prevent wars by controlling our own worst instincts, because narcissism prevents us from acknowledging how depraved our real instincts are from birth. They're hormonal. They don't want to accept that. Oh, we must be good. We must be better. If you're living that delusion, you're never going to understand the importance of separation of powers. We got to pit bad guys against bad guys so things don't deteriorate. And that's very, very hard to get rid of narcissism. You know, it's like a pandemic. Its evil influence is worse than COVID-19. Anyway, we go back to where I started. This is 1933. Two of the greatest thinkers in the history of mankind, Freud, Einstein, they had no clue. How are you going to stop? I don't blame them because this is institutional. You know, they haven't focused, my life is focused on allocation of power, you know, not equals MC squared or interpreting dreams, like Freud and Einstein. But I believe that if we are serious about the future, this is what our focus has to be. Because given our technological progress, given our ability to find greater and greater ways with less and less moral inhibitions, most recently with drones, but I'm sure we'll find other weapons where we can kill without finding the inhibition that comes when you're looking at somebody in their face and have to take a knife or a gun and shoot them in the head. If you're thousands of miles away, it's much easier to kill, so that the threshold needed to get into war becomes lower. That if we don't, through the summit of the future, seriously devote our intellect and energies to stopping institutionally this encouragement towards war by the executive, species is going the way of the dinosaurs. I think all scientists will tell you, if there's any chance at all that something will occur, no matter how infinitesimal, if time is infinite, it's going to happen. It just is a matter of whether it's a few years or 1,000 years or a million years, right? There's certainly the risk of nuclear, obliteration is there, right? I don't know. I'm not smart enough because I don't know quantum mechanics to give a percentage. But I know that time is infinite. And given if we don't change the nature of who can go to war, it's only a matter of time when we confront nuclear Armageddon. We'll destroy ourselves. A species will become extinct. And that's what I hope we can avoid. It can be avoided, but only if we start to make the brains, our cerebral faculties, the dominant leitmotif in civilization and not the hormonal faculties. Well, I don't know. I've probably bored everybody to death, and I appreciate everybody holding on. But I think I've kind of covered as much as I can say without, probably causing tedium because it's been a long presentation. So it would be a wonderful opportunity to entertain any questions, and then I can elaborate further.
Thank you so much. I do have a couple of points, but I'm going to save it at the end because we have a question by Ms. Maratha Hunt, and I will call on her. And please unmute your mic and pose your question about education, peace education system.
Thank you so much. Your presentation was amazing. And I'm in Rotary, the Rotary Action Group for Peace. And I know that in the United States, in most high schools, they have a program, ROTC, the military program. And I'm wondering how peace classes can get equal time, so to speak, in high schools, and how we can start. In the Rotary Action Group for Peace, we have peace language classes and workshops, and we teach the 8 pillars of positive peace. And how can we start peace classes in our high schools?
Well, as you know, education in the United States is very decentralized. I think there are like 20,000 school boards. So I think what you need to do is go to the school boards. And also, and if they don't have a curriculum that teaches peace, and what are the ingredients of ensuring peace, how you institutionalize it. So it isn't just one person. It isn't just hoping Jesus arrives, the Messiah arrives. You build it into the system so that peace is going to be naturally flowing if the people with the power to decide to go to war don't have any incentive to do so. And so that you encourage them, you need to be part of the curriculum. And I would urge you to consider, say, why don't our teachers have teach-in programs? Or why don't they go on, and I would teach any of these courses to teach a program. This is how you teach your students these things. So, because they're not going to, most of the, when you look at education programs in the United States today, most of them aren't teaching teachers like this, teach them to make sure they don't throw the erasers at you and you do X, Y, Z. But these philosophical things are not there, and they need to be. When I was reading to my 5-year-old daughter, her name was Hillary, even at age 5, she was asking questions. We were reading the Iliad and the Odyssey. Well, why are they running and going to war over Helen of Troy? And how it was unfair when Iphigenia was killed by Agamemnon, so he got the waters to subside so he could go across the Aegean Sea to kill the Trojans in Troy. So that young kids, even at that age, they have a moral sense. If you work on it, they understand that, and they're interested as well.
I think so too. That's why I've been trying to work on that very thing. Thank you so much.
Wonderful.
I'd like to be hopeful, and you mentioned that we're not gonna see perhaps our lifetime that any country, any executive power raging war and killing and demonstrating power through killing. That's not gonna happen our lifetime. What can change that?
I don't think that you can change the executive, mentality, because the incentive is everywhere. Because the executive says in wartime, look, even Netanyahu in Israel, he's in power because they're at war. His popularity is like, I don't know, in almost single digits, because there's such an incentive for an executive to remain in war. He gets the appointments, he gets the secrecy, he gets the glory, he gets the adrenaline high and all that. They don't do it. None of them. I can't say a single executive. There was only one executive, actually, in the history of the world. Turned war down. Congress wanted to give James Madison, our 4th president, he said, hey, you can go to war against Britain or France if you want to, because they're intercepting and interfering with our maritime commerce. He said, no, you have to vote on it, not me. You can't give it to me. Now, that's almost unique in the annals of executives. They grab power every time they can get it. They don't turn it aside. So I do not think that's why, unless you give it to the legislature, who doesn't have any incentive to exercise it. I say, even in the United States, where you have super war hawks in the House and the Senate, when presidents have actually said, okay, vote for war, they say, no way, we're not going to do that. They're too risky. And plus, what's in it for them? Nothing. And I think that this is just a matter of recognizing, and this is what makes it so difficult. And include myself in being reluctant to understand, how narcissistic the species is, and doesn't want to say, hey, how come we're the only species that organizes on an industrial scale to kill each other? And I don't see giraffes doing that, or lions, or tigers, or orangutans. What's going on here? It's very hard. So I understand why there's a huge reluctance to accept the facts and the knowledge needed to correct it. But you got to recognize the source of the problem. Otherwise, you don't have any solution, as painful as it can be.
To maybe add on it, unless there is anyone else, since we are presenting this concept with you, it's our great pride for us, in support of the Summit of the Future, and a project we came up is a vision. It's not going to happen in a year or two, maybe 10, 15, maybe 20 years, hopefully. In support of the Summit of the Future, a compulsory peace education, ICTs, from K-12, from kindergarten, because all countries don't require kindergarten. Western countries might, but most of them not. So that's why we are also persistent to add from K-12 and beyond. So you mentioned that the future, this is, the future is not going to sustain as we are in today wars. But your overarching concept in connection with our proposed vision, what is, or what are the pathway in terms of legislative policy, international law, really to changes and use ICTs for peace education starting kindergarten?
Well, it goes back to education, education, and more education. You got to teach the people, and that's what ultimate sovereignty is in the people. So it becomes the ethos of the entire culture. But it's got to be educated ethos. It's got to understand why war is so bad. It legalizes first-degree murder. It looks at all these horrible things that happen. But it doesn't happen spontaneously. I go back to the fact that we're all born, all hormonal, when we come out of the womb, right? And so we need immediately start to work on, let's make the cerebral faculties, our thinking faculties, our moral faculties, dominant and control the hormonal gratifications that drive us from birth. And if we can do that, that is how we make progress. Now, you're right. It's not going to happen overnight because education takes time. Look at the people who are already, they're already 50, 60, 70. They already have this mindset that war and killing and being number one makes us great. So they're kind of lost, and they have so much money to be made in the existing and the status quo that they're not going to recant. But the young people, they don't have any status quo to defend, that benefits them. They're just little kids. So they believe the right thing. So I say, that's why I could talk to my daughter at age 5. She doesn't have any inhibitions. Says, that was stupid. Why did Agamemnon kill his daughter Iphigenia for some dumb war over Helen of Troy? Because at that age, they don't have any artificial impediments to understanding truth. And that's why you need to start the education early on. But I want to underscore, when I say education, I don't mean that just in a classroom. Education's got to be in the home. It's got to be books, reading, writing, thinking. It's got to be everywhere. Debate, moot courts should be celebrated more than football games. And then we should give prizes to them. Often I wrote recently, well, okay, we had wonderful Olympics in Paris, but it's just for physical strength. Where are the Olympics for moral virtue? Where's the Olympics for those who can create peace? Where are the Olympics for the march of the mind? There aren't any, right? So that's just one insignia of how far, at least at present, the species is from celebrating the right thing, that makes us human, namely our brains, our moral antenna. Our humanity is not demonstrated by running really fast around a track. It's not demonstrated by really swimming very fast. There may be other species can swim faster than we are. I don't know, orangutans or who knows. I can see some species probably can swim faster than we can. That isn't what our humanity is about. What earmarks us is brain power, ability to think, do the right thing, seek justice more than power. And that has to be inculcated from day one. So the parents need to inculcate that in their kids, give them rewards, talking around the table. What is this? What is that? Are we doing the right thing here and there? What justifies this? And so, I think it's not helpful to conceive of education as just what you learn in the classroom. It's 24 hours a day. I try to make sure that I'm thinking all the time. There's not kind of a timeout where you turn into a lobotomized, animal. That's dangerous. You use your brain all the time in different contexts, different ways.
There is one follow-up question by Maratha Hunt. She says that, does he think the world will be better off if more women were in public offices?
Unfortunately, I think it will stay the same. I do not think, and although it's true that women have been kept out of power, but not exclusively, for many generations and decades. When they do have had an opportunity to rise to the peak of power, have been women dictators, Catherine the Great in Russia being one example. They haven't shown themselves to be any less ruthless, in exercising war powers than men, unfortunately. And Catherine the Great, she retained Voltaire to write a book of laws, and at the end she threw them all out. Said, "Listen, I don't want any restraints on my ability." So she's fighting wars. She goes in and she partitions Poland with Austria-Hungary and with Germany and otherwise, just like everyone else does. Now, however, I do think it's kind of counterintuitive, because I do think because women give birth, they naturally are more reluctant to believe that you should kill someone. Men don't give birth, so they don't have that instinctual nurturing instinct. But unfortunately, when it comes to power, the women seem to renounce that positive instinct. I think of Secretary of State Hillary Clinton in Libya. We saw he died, turned Libya into a wilderness, It still remains that day today. I have people wanting me to consult to try to turn Libya into a real country again. We destroyed it. And Hillary Clinton was the biggest voice, the vocal voice. Oh, this is smart power at its best. So, although I would like to think if women were more prominent, and I could give more examples. Indira Gandhi in India was not somebody who was reluctant to use power. Benazir Bhutto in Pakistan. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to be a cure. And if you ask me today, if we have Kamala Harris elected president in the United States as opposed to Donald Trump in November, do I think she's going to have a different attitude about supplying weapons to Israel to commit all these war crimes? No, she hasn't said anything right now. She says, well, okay, I sympathize with the Gazans, but she's not said, we're not going to ship weapons to countries that use them to commit war crimes. Silence on that, unfortunately.
Indeed, that's a little bit worrisome, and it's kind of endorse your comment that it's not going to change anytime soon. But I still want to kind of bring up the hopeful perception based on, if I took not correctly, you quoted by John Adams that our glory is liberty, and then you perfectly illustrated what went wrong and where we are today. So how to re-own it in terms of true institutional level, politics, education, university, public, private sector, and private sector has great power, as you know, especially ICTs now running the world, in my opinion. And also you mentioned this is really also a question about democracy, huge campaign by the corporation, especially those weapon producers, war lovers companies. So in that context, and as we all know well, that United Nations formed by the member states, and then although the commitment for the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, commitment for the UN Charter, commitment for the Sustainable Development Goals, and now recent commitment for the Summit of the Future, Pact to the Future, for our common agenda, for our common future. But the end doesn't change, as you illustrated. So what will make to change from the UN ground, national ground, and also especially from the public education system, both country-based and international level? Thank you.
Well, I don't think, it's a wonderful question. I don't think that I may use different words to say or to repeat myself, and that is you have to inculcate, educational norms, ethical, moral, philosophical norms from day one, from kindergarten on. Reading books, talking to them. And again, let's not do this by email. Let's not do this even by Zoom. It's got to be personal, because human beings are emotional creatures. They learn if they get both an emotional satisfaction as well as an intellectual one, right? That's just natural, because we can't stop being human. So this needs to be FaceTime with the teachers, with the parents, with the friends. Sit and talk about it. This is the wrong thing to do. If we have to demonstrate, if we have to write a letter to the editor, write a letter, show up at a member's house or a local board members, or talk to a teacher afterwards, it has to be part of your own existence. It can't be compartmentalized. Well, this is the hour of the day that I set aside to think about being a human being. It has to be with you 24 hours a day, that this is what it means to be civilized, especially because our own Declaration of Independence here celebrates that's part of what we call self-governance, right? You can't have self-governance unless you have people who are educated. They know how to think, okay, I'm governing myself. How should I cast my vote? What's the right thing to do? And that will spread if you can get that inculcated, institutionalized, so the teachers and the parents and the kids and the awards and everybody else all works in harmony. It will have a dramatic effect overnight. Now, we were, maybe I would call it almost a miracle, that we had a society that was at least comparable to what I'm describing in 1787. With regard to the leaders and the education, and John Quincy Adams, who I quoted, she's raised, what did he get his learning? Not from the father, but from Abigail Adams, who was educated and taught him, these are the books you need to read. She told him, you're going to be president of the United States one day. And at that time, no, we did not have football players that were celebrated. We didn't have people who ran fast and could run marathons who were celebrated. We didn't have Olympic Games in the United States. Those who were at the top of the social ladder were people with brains. James Madison was not an impressive physical species, but he had brain power, and so he was honored and revered. They asked him, well, you spent your time thinking and writing and reading. And he was engaged in politics as early as age 25, but it didn't give up his reading. And so, but that doesn't exist today. And I'm not trying to deride Taylor Swift. I'm sure she has many great talents, but inculcating wisdom and philosophy is not one of them. She's able to provide an enormous amount of amusement to a very large number of people, but it's an amusement. It's an amusement that you can get by going to the zoo as well. We need to celebrate people who go beyond Taylor Swift and inculcate courage, philosophy, and live with you forever, right? It won't go away like the Taylor Swift concert comes and goes. No, once you have wisdom, you have a moral foundation, you have an asset 24 hours a day for the remainder of your life. That's way more valuable than anything else you can have.
Thank you, Bruce.
It's really
this was
Uğur Bey?
yes.
Yes.
If Bruce has
Would you like
other,
to please?
Yes.
Take the floor.
Yes. If Bruce Fein has other subjects that he would like to add to his speech, I think he can continue, and later on we take the rest of the questions.
I think anything further I could say would just provide more historical detail, I believe, to the basic principles that I've announced. And I don't want to overextend my welcome with the audience have been very attentive. Because basically, in my view, I'm just proving it's like Newton proving his laws of motion the 8 millionth time. It's the same everywhere, right? And if you want to argue it's not going to work in Australia, just try it. It is. Because I consider this understanding of the species, this lust, craving for power for its own sake, being the dominant force in human affairs, as being, it is to political science what Newton laws of motion are to physics, and what Einstein's theories of general and special relativity are to quantum mechanics. Now, people are reluctant to say that, say, no, we can't. There's hard sciences and soft sciences. But I disagree, because I've looked at virtually every civilization from the beginning of time, read tens of thousands of books. I said to spend 500,000 hours thinking about this. And it always comes back the same. Among other things, or he told me, the Ottoman Empire was at war every single day for 4 or 5 centuries. Never ended. Why are you fighting? Well, we just fight. We just want more land. We go up to Vienna and then we come back. But what happened? The Sultan stayed the same. There wasn't any real purpose to it other than fighting for the sake of fighting. And I think that if you look around, if I make a comment today, for example, with regard to the Middle East, Ukraine, no one has a clue what's supposed to happen to end all of what I call this madness. Killing without an end game. What are you going to do afterwards? And you really think that the body count is going to cure anything? No, you're creating more enemies. You think anybody's going to like you if you try to destroy them and their home and their kids and their relatives? No. And you can look in all these situations. If you look at Zelensky, if you look at Netanyahu, or who his replacement, if he doesn't stay around, it's all going to be the executive. Netanyahu decides everything that goes on in the Israel military. And it's Zelensky in Ukraine and Putin in Russia. You just see, and why the United States is entering in. Yeah, we have Biden doing this. Now, he kind of growls sotto voce, but he doesn't change anything. So, and you look everywhere else in the world where the aggressive tactics are in China, this is all just the person at the top who decides this. And it's all secret, and it's all threat inflation, trying to scare us all into thinking, oh my gosh, if we don't have a defense perimeter that goes out from 1,000 miles to 2,000 to 7,000, we'll all die tomorrow. And it's the purpose of our cerebral faculty to say that's just nonsense and ridiculous. We have self-defense, and and it is true from the beginning of time. People fight for their own country more than somebody else's. We discovered that in Vietnam. We had all the military advantage in the world over the North Vietnamese, and we lost the war. Wasn't even close, because they're going to be willing to die for their country more than we are, because it's not our country. But it all goes back, again, to the fact that you are not going to get legislative bodies to vote to go to war. It's not because legislators have higher moral principles than executive officials, and not because they have higher wisdom, but it's all about politics and power, and they get nothing out of it. So why should they vote for it? Unless, we've actually been attacked and we're already at war, like in Pearl Harbor. And then I'll repeat, the only way this is going to happen is to institutionalize educating these precepts from day one, kindergarten on. There's no reason why that even at kindergarten age, that children can't be exposed to these issues of morality, life, and death. They're smart enough at that age, 5. Then, okay, doing orthography or writing or even doing calculations. The moral instruction is more important than the instruction on STEM and getting along on your computer, your new iPhone, or whatever else. And that has to be first. And the teachers need to be selected based upon their ability to provide this kind of moral, philosophical instruction, and not just keeping erasers from being thrown, although that's important. But if you make a classroom sufficiently electrifying and intellectually stimulating, you won't need to worry about that. The kids inherently would be more engaged in deciding on, when's it important to kill somebody else and when not, than they are in doing some stupid viewing on how you put lipstick on a TikTok program. So that's really all I have to add. And I don't think, and I'm telling the audience here that all that I've said is just verified. You just pick any history book you look at, you look around the world today, all these wars ongoing, all the misery. It's always the executive, never the legislative branch is standing up there. You think, now sometimes they serve as a clack and will clap because the executive can hand them out, bonuses or money or something, but they're not the ones who initiate this. And it's because that's built into the species. And until we understand that, we're not going to make any progress. And I say, if we go back even thousands of years, have we made progress in STEM? We can go to the moon, all sorts of technological progress. We've made zero progress on a moral philosophical scale because we've refused to acknowledge and see what our gratifications in DNA is really like, so we can try to diminish how much horror it's engaged in to inflict harm on ourselves.
Thank you very much, Bruce. We have a few questions following on this, but I'd like to reiterate what you explained here. Until we get our children, new young generations, start thinking better and more, being more advanced on cerebral context than being the actually puppet of their hormonal gratifications. It'll be a struggle for us. But this movement is actually going in the right direction. Mm-hmm. Education of the peace and understanding the root cause and how we can control going forward into the K1 through 12 is the best option. And here's one question. You mentioned the war in Ukraine and Palestine and Israel between. The question is, how come the West is supporting these wars? Where is the moral of this, of them supporting this or not trying to do anything to stop it? That's one. The other one is the call for the peace of this war happening in Gaza and in the Middle East getting spread around. How is that going to look like going to end if the international law and in the peace that a lot of people are asking or looking for is the majority? But how is that not going to getting to a conclusion?
Okay.
Something wrong in this.
Okay, so let me take them seriatim. Why does the West, support the wars in the Middle East and Ukraine? In some sense, it's a proxy war. In the United States, we believe that we, with an alliance with Israel, can project our power. Since we have influence over Israel, since we give them so much money, $3-4 billion a year, and simply, I think, a counterproductive, projection of power. Well, we need allies over there. I said, well, I think it's wrongheaded. The United States survived very well before Israel even became a nation in 1948. Israel doesn't fight in our wars. I don't expect them to. I said, Israel cares about Israel, not the United States, and we should take the same attitude. But for political reasons, dynamic reasons, and the ability of Israel to be very, very clever in their lobbying through American Israeli Public Affairs Committee, the United States basically has turned into Israel's poodle for the particular time. Now, we support Ukraine because Ukraine enables us to fight Russia in our effort to dominate the world. In a moment, I think, of rashness, President Biden said, yeah, we need to get rid of Vladimir Putin, thinking that George Washington is going to be replacing Vladimir Putin. He said, well, in the history of Russia's long history, there aren't any James Madisons there ever appeared. It's stupid. The idea that you can make certain that what follows a dictator is a less bad dictator is absurd. Mubarak was a bad dictator in Egypt, but El Sisi is even a worse one, and we're responsible for that in part. So the fact is, the West is just sometimes it's vicariously through third parties projecting its power. Even though, and I think there seems to be, and I could be wrong, an implicit assumption that countries act rationally in this area. Not true. countries regularly act against their own interests in going to war. Stupid. Napoleon acted against the French interests in marching to Moscow in 1812. Stupid, but he did it. Because this craving for power is so great, it overwhelms the cerebral faculties and they do things that become self-ruinous. Now, what about the Middle East? We have the war now. It's Gaza, West Bank, spread to Lebanon. I guess now there's attack by Israel on the Houthis in Yemen, may go to Syria and Iran soon. My conclusion, I've said this from October 7th onward, it doesn't have any clear end. I don't see any dynamic where there's any incentive on any side, to come to any kind of agreement. Israel knows that it can do whatever it wants. They aren't going to suffer any pushback from the United States. They haven't, from the Congress. And Netanyahu visits the United States. This is after we had the grisly events in Gaza and the humanitarian starvation crisis and the preliminary ruling out of the International Court of Justice that what's happening in Gaza is genocide. And he gets over 50 standing ovations from the U.S., a joint session of the U.S. Congress. So we're not going to push back. So what's his incentive to stop? None. He needs it in some sense to avoid, the pushing forward on his criminal prosecution. And then you look on the other side. It's unfortunate, but all politics is driven by ulterior motives. So stabbing in the back, I believe, I'm convinced that Maronite Lebanese conspired with Israel to give them intelligence about Hezbollah and Nasrallah, and even the booby traps of the pagers and the walkie-talkies, because they're fighting for their power. They're Christian. Hezbollah is Muslim. They got all sorts of factions. And that's true of all these other countries, too. I mean, in Iran, too, you have Shias, you have Kurds, you have other factions. So they all looking at opportunities to take power. So it's unfortunate that the Arab world is very, very divided. And Iran's not actually part of the Arab world, but it's equally divided. And I don't see certainly what's the incentive for Hamas, who's going to surrender. And especially because, at least at present, what's come after, I mean, Netanyahu has made it clear he's not ever, as long as he's in power, his successor, any authority in Gaza or West Bank have any connection with, even by eighth degrees, to Hamas. Well, who else is there? There isn't anybody else. We're not building right now, a new successor regime to Hamas or the Palestinian Authority, which has shown itself to be a complete empty vessel. So instead of working on right now, to try to establish a new political class that has educated in the arts of politics. When I say the art of politics, the art of running a country where the rule of law obtains, not just rule of terror and fear and no free speech. None of that's ongoing. Now, obviously, if you're under attack and you think you're going to be killed in the next half hour, you don't have that luxury. But that's where there should be at least some group in exile. Somebody should be thinking about this. How do we put this together again? And that's not going on at all. And it's not a condition, certainly, of what the U.S. has put. We haven't put any conditions on our arms shipments to Israel for its use, however they wish. So as bleak as it seems, because I don't revel in the misery that's being inflicted daily, I don't see any endpoint right now. You could call me back a year from now. We could have this same conversation about what's happening in the Middle East.
I hope that's not going to be the case in terms of what's happening in the Middle East. It's going to be the same next year, too. It's really very worrisome, but we are all looking for the way what we can, and collaboratively, how we can really have a positive impact. Thank you so much. And David J. Newman has a lengthy comment, and if he likes to present himself, or would you like me read for you? Mr. Newman.
Yeah, my comments are in the chat. I'm from Winnipeg, Manitoba, Canada. And I'm a Rotarian for many years. I left for a while because I was disappointed in their boldness to do what I thought had to be done. But I came back because I saw no alternative. But really what I wanted to share with you after that inspiring talk, which aligns very closely to what I have spent maybe the same number of hours as Bruce has in a lifetime of a desire for liberty and justice, to be an ethos in Canada and throughout the world. But the United States of America did not support UNESCO for a long period of time for reasons I won't go into. But the United Nations Scientific Education Cultural Organization has been a leader, of course, since 1945. And I might say in 1942, the seeds were sown in London, England, for UNESCO to come into being, because never again did we want to have another war like what was happening in World War II. But recently, in the United States, the Global Campaign for Peace Education, allying with UNESCO, has in 2023 replaced the principles for peace education in schools on our planet with the support of 194 UNESCO members. And this was in 2023. And those two entities, one led by a Brit who's in America, and the UNESCO, of course, with its headquarters in Paris, France, together are doing some amazing things in a collaborative effort to nurture, nudge, and integrate peace education curricula in every country in the world. Now, the UNESCO has a project for years, and our province joined into it in 2002. And that is the UNESCO Associated Schools Network project, which has many UNESCO schools, which have in them the very ethos that Bruce has eloquently and passionately described today. We also have a wonderful American named Paul Capus Chappelle, who was a retired captain serving in Iraq, went to West Point, but served with the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation. But he's now created the Peace Literacy Institute, and he operates out of Portland, California. And he's a dear friend of mine, but a wonderful human being who we brought to Winnipeg to talk about his principles for peace literacy education. He's written multi-books on the subject, and it was so uplifting that the consultants in the Department of Education, who I had him present to with my presence, from all disciplines, bought into the idea of integrating peace literacy education and positive peace education in Manitoba. So what you have put on your screen, I've indicated that I'm now working on a Rules of Law on Earth project because I'm a retired lawyer and was a member of the executive branch of the government for a period of time. So everything that Bruce says, I very much agree with and am motivated by. And the Rules of Law on Earth project is adding another branch of separation of powers, not as the judicial branch. And we think that the judicial branch globally can be enhanced and emboldened, but it is going to require the United States of America to lead this and offer this. And I'm pleased to work with anyone in the United States. And my responsibility is my country of Canada, and we got a lot of work to do here. But I work with any American that is prepared to do what Bruce is urging you to do in any way I can through all my areas of influence. So thank you for this presentation.
Thank you. Now, I suppose Mr. Fein would like to comment on that, and Burcu from ATA, she likes to take the floor after you respond.
Okay, I would just like to say that I work with the group Ralph Nader called the Center for corporate responsibility, law and corporate responsibility. It's headquartered in Washington. But if you would share through whoever you need to share through your contact information, it's a starting point anyway, because we're also a 501c3 organization.
It's in the chat. I put it in the general chat to your leader who's hosting this.
Wonderful. Let me, I'll follow up then.
I will
think
share.
It's a wonderful opportunity.
Now I'd like to invite Burcu Tansu from ATA. Floor is yours. Because she asked to take the floor.
Well, we have a question from ATA already, so we can continue with it.
I just want to thank all of you. All of my questions answered. I don't want to take or steal your time. I just want to relay my thanks to the organization Light Millennium and TADAlliance. Mr. Kara, it's been a while. We didn't see you or talk to you. It was a great pleasure to see you in this floor. Bruce Fein, thank you so much. It was a very enlightened program. I didn't intend to join today, but I had a time and I did, and I'm so glad I did. Thank you very much, Bircan Hanım, and I extend my appreciation for this program. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Uğur Bey?
Thank you very much, Burcu. We have a question from ATA Management, Ale Whelan. The question is to Mr. Bruce Fein, and she's talking about while we are in the United Nations Summit of Future conferences are taking place, and the intellectual and communication technologies are being discussed, part of the education and communication. She is expressing her worries about the human rights of the minority groups, which is mostly taking place heavily in the lobbying and impact of those lobbying on the local legislations. So legislators are through this getting influenced by the lobbies, and curriculums of the schools and the school managements are getting updated and politicized. She's asking, how do we get this politics out of the schools, out of education, out of curriculums? And how can we protect this for the future? Because politics is not stopping where it is. It wants to influence everywhere, starting from of the children.
Well, when you start out with, when you have self-government means in some sense politics governs everything. That means your influence, everybody has a right to speak and try to influence those who exercise power. It's not neutral because human beings have their biases. So if you don't have groups who can see the warping organized and present, as you have a right under the First Amendment, your redress of grievances, this is wrong, show up with the board, with the teacher, this is our curriculum, have something alternative to suggest to them. Make sure that if there's oftentimes their local school board elections, show up and vote. It's just a fact of politics. You can not realistically expect, somebody who sits on the school board to pay attention equally to somebody who says, you know what, I can keep you get reelected, and somebody who says, well, you don't show up and they're not going to participate. That's just not how human beings operate. And it's been, in some sense, quite disappointing for me, but it's come to try that for many of minority groups that get squashed, they have a very difficult time organizing and getting together and understanding that if they don't stand up for their own rights, they're not going to have any. You could say, well, but it's too hard. I have other things to do. That may be. But I'm just telling you as a political fact of life, if it's not done, the lobbyists will succeed. But the good news is the First Amendment right protects everybody to have a lobby too, including minorities. And sometimes they succeed. I mean, it took a long time, but, blacks were separate but equal for 58 years before Brown against Board of Education, and took a lot of struggle. But whatever it is there, we still have racial discrimination, but it's nothing what it was 100 years ago. But they had to organize, they had to protest, they had to speak up. So if you live under a system of self-governance, sitting it out, in my judgment, is not an option. You have an obligation. Because it's self-government, you're not just taking orders from above. To participate and educate yourself and try to influence. Learn the arts of communication. You don't have to be nasty, but say this is what's wrong and this is how you can improve it, and etc. And there are other people that you can, I think, enlist to help on that score. But ultimately, it's got to be at that grassroots level. Otherwise, all history teaches, no, the minority will be squashed.
Thank you so much. If is there any other, maybe we may move to closing. Is there any question before we move to closing section? And also, Mr. Fein, if you'd like to add something overall.
No, I think I've already spoken.
Birjan, I have a question, if I may.
Yes.
This is
yes.
Peter. This is
yes,
Peter Ojeda.
Peter. Yes, please.
Yes, I very much enjoyed your speech, your talk, Dr. Fein. My father was an American history teacher, so it was very refreshing to hear kind of some of the deep dives that support a discussion. And thank you for that. Currently, next week I'll be speaking as one of the speakers on efforts we're undertaking in Africa. And the African Union calls for peace education in their 50-year plan. And it requires a Pan-African perspective to really appreciate something like a 50-year plan from the African Union. My question is there any United States potential impediments that you see politically from your experience to a more Pan-African Africa, where things like peace education could be more easily kind of distributed and taken to the masses? Or maybe some of your insights about what happened with Gaddafi, because he was very well known as a Pan-African, among other things, and why that all happened. So thank you very much.
Our involvement in Africa at present is simply responsive to what we view, because we're an empire, Chinese, Russian presence there, right? It's all reactive. It's like the stupidity, Congo, Belgium gets out, oh, Russia's in, but Lumumba going to be a communist, so we go in, try to assassinate him, and the whole thing blows up in smoke. And we still have Congo today, still is a mess. And we supported Mobutu for all these years because, well, okay, he didn't like communists, so we would support him. So unfortunately, our focus on Africa is almost exclusively on just trying to give China and Russia a black eye. The Wagner Group is in there, and it's a big mess. I don't see that we affirmatively would oppose, the ambitions that you've described for your group, but that's certainly not going to be the number one priority. It's just trying to win countries away from the other two rival powers that we see in Asia, in Russia, in part in Europe. It's unfortunate because I think there's a whole lot that we have to offer positively, but I'm saying at present, the military-industrial complex runs our foreign policy, and you see it every day.
Okay.
Let me just
give
you one example. If I could just add one little point. Perhaps the high water mark of our lunacy, if you will, was Libya. This is after Gaddafi renounces WMD, right? Afterwards, we're trying to normalize. I'm not trying to praise Gaddafi. He'd had a lot of crazy things about it, but this is, all right, and we had confirmation, negotiated banning him WMD. Then we go in, overthrow him, he gets killed, and that sends a message to Iran and North Korea and otherwise, there's only one way the United States is going to stay out of your country. You got to have a nuclear capacity. Look what happened to Gaddafi. That's exactly what happened. The day that Gaddafi was overthrown, the North Korean and the Iranian press were saying, not going to happen to us, that's for sure. So you can see how stupid our policy is. And we claim, oh, we're against proliferation. The guy who stopped proliferation, you kill. What do you think that sends the message to anybody else? And this isn't this, that is not some of the crazy R's. This is Obama. This is Hillary Clinton. This is Susan Rice. Did you think about that? I talked to somebody at the CIA. He was a deputy director, and he had negotiated WMD. He told me, Bruce, after that, no other country in the world, we'll never be able to negotiate a non-nuclear program ever again after what we did here. So unfortunately, our foreign policy is very irrational, except if you just have a power curve that you measure it on. But I don't think we would affirmatively try to interfere with what you're doing. But I don't think, you're going to get financial support or anything else like that from the United States, because we're just fixated on China and Russia.
Okay. Interesting. All right. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I'd like to have as a positive tone ending. I mean, in terms of overall concept, it's not so kind of encouraging the war picture as we live in today. But at the same time, as everything else, ICTs also might be one of the most destructive power along with AI, but also it may change rapidly things all around. What is your standpoint on that?
Well, surely, AI and communications means that you can spread good ideas as fast as you can the bad ideas, right? So the technology can be turned to our benefit. Right now, it's turned to our disadvantage because the people who use it most are spreading the bad or horrible ideas. So that's positive. But I think I can leave on this note. You can call it positive or not. I don't want to overstate, what can happen in the short run, because I agree, people like to think positive, and I think that's a good idea. That's why we sell life insurance and not death insurance, because we like to think about life rather than death, right? But this is a story, and I've told it to her many times. So there's a little child, 5 years old, comes to the beach, and he sees like 20, 30,000 fish. They're stranded at high tide. He picks up one of the fish, throws it back into the sea. An old man by says, "Why did you do that? It's not going to help anything. Look at all these other fish. They're all going to die. They're stranded." And the little boy says, "It mattered to that one fish, and that's good enough." So we need to be able to accept, hey, we got to try. Even if we just save one fish, it's good enough.
That's a great ending in terms of concluding, giving a really positive, hopeful. Otherwise, it's kind of so discouraging because we can't change on the individual level of the executive power's decisions, what they're going to take next. And even at the UN, 24 of September, it is clearly discussed. It's a matter, a question which country is next, and there are some indication about that after Gaza, Libya, Yemen, all that. So really we need something to encourage and empower us in terms of as a collaborative positive ideas that we might have hopefully some change in a positive direction. So thank you. Really, it is our honor to have you, Mr. Fein. It is really like world-class, top-class course. I'm so happy and excited, and all the information will be shared, especially setting out the ground for also our proposed vision and all the challenges on the way. But we are determined to collaborate and move forward and at least push forward, work towards to that. Now, then, 1 second, I'm sorry, something is stuck here. Okay. Now for the closing, as you all know, this exclusive session with Mr. Bruce Fein, attorney at law and author, on stopping war through separation of powers, entrusting the power exclusively to legislators has been brought to you by the Light Millennium, a charitable global human advancement organization based in New York, associated with the United Nations Department of Global Communications, and a specially accredited organization to the UN 2024 Summit of the Future. Our prospect board member, Vrushali Gaikwad and UN Youth Rep Mimosa Ertem help us, and especially as you are aware of now, this project brought to you in collaboration with TADAlliance and with Mr. Ur Kara. We thank, along with who mentioned, UNDGC Civil Society Unit bi-weekly. This program plays by Tuesday newsletter of the UNDGC. And I'd like to thank to Harvey Dupiton sharing it through UNJ International Week Group, and John L. German disseminating it through his extensive network, Turkish Forum, Türkiye'yiz biz, and for supporting our outreach efforts. Our next session on the compulsory peace education, ICTs from kindergarten to K-12 and beyond, is scheduled for Saturday, October 5th, 2024 at 11 a.m. And I am happy and excited to share with you that along with Professor Victor Lawrence and Mr. Fein also will be delivering concluding remarks, since it's a full pack program with 20 plus speakers. So therefore, we aim to present the first inaugural session of this concept with multiple participatory inaugural session from a diverse perspectives, that we can also have, again, a compact concluding remarks by next Saturday. Also, this is open to coalition. We already formed a coalition, already 16, including Light Millennium. And we hope this is, again, it's not a year or overnight or next 2 years, but we hope to see this vision incorporated with the UN, the next stage of the sustainable development goals from 2030 to 2045. Hopefully by the 2045, it will become a backbone of the global education system. Mr. Newman mentioned UNESCO and some UNESCO schools, but I hope in this really marrying ICTs with the peace education and becoming compulsory education through all UN system, 193 countries. Otherwise, we may be really on the ruin by the executive power wherever we live in, as we now understand better than ever, thanks to Mr. Fein on that. With an overarching hope that division will become a part of backbone of the global education system, as I indicated. In this context, we look forward to collaborate and meeting with you all again in a similar program soon. And please check out our website, www.lmglobal.org, and follow us through LinkedIn and X. So as I indicated, this is our program. As you can see, we form a coalition for this project, and we need member states and UN entities really to take this vision to the UNGA Hall as a resolution, or to be incorporated with the next stage of the Millennium Declaration. So this is all on the web. And Urbe?
I think we're all good. I don't have
Do you
anything.
have anything for the concluding?
Thank you very much. I was very pleased to be here with all of you. And again, it was another excellent learning session for me, for myself, and I hope everybody got the same feeling. I don't have anything to add, and I hope everybody to be able to join next time. And this is our education and also teaching is going to continue. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Urbe. This is indeed our second unique collaboration. And I think this document, in terms of the, hopefully we'll able to post the transcription along with video, that will be a source, whoever is looking and searching on these ideas, really to ground his or her perception and
That's right.
working and studying.
So we'll be creating the transcript of this video and translating to at least 4 or 5 languages and then publish it out.
Excellent. Thank you for joining us.